Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Collateral Global podcast, where we explore the legacy of the COVID-19 pandemic on science, society, and public health policy. My guest today is Professor Shahar Hameiri, a political economist from the University of Queensland. He's the author, together with Tom Chodor, of the book, The Locked Up Country, Learning the Lessons from Australia's COVID-19 Response, released in October of last year. So thanks so much for joining us today, Professor Shahar.
Hi, Kevin. It's great to be here.
So let's just jump right into it. I'm curious about this title, Locked Up Country. Why did you decide on that?
Well, those who are familiar with Australia would know a book that was written in the 1960s called The Lucky Country by a guy called Donald Horne. And that book has a kind of mythical status in Australia. It's where the tagline, The Lucky Country, comes from. But those who are not familiar with the book would think that Donald Horne is using the term the lucky country in a kind of literal sense, but in fact is using it in an ironic sense. So what he's talking about in the book is that Australia is a lucky country that, by lack of geography and its particular history, just manages to, especially for its political leaders and its industrialists, that was his main focus at the time, they just seem to kind of coast on that luck. You know, they don't need to do much, they don't innovate. They kind of just get on with things, just roll on, and things just seem to work out quite well. But he expected that things will not continue to go as well as they did, simply because the world was changing. This is the 1960s. So he was particularly worried about the Cold War, and the kind of world that Australia has benefited from would not exist in the future. So we need to get a lot smarter and do things better, and so on and so forth. And it struck Tom and me when we were working on the book that actually a lot of what Donald Horne was talking about seemed really quite similar to the experience of the pandemic in Australia, in the sense that Australian plans for the pandemic were not actually very good, and there was very little to back them up in terms of actual capacity to get things done in the health system and so on. And then the pandemic hit, and Australia imposed a lockdown, a coordinated lockdown across the whole country, and closed borders. But by the virtue of its geography, the kind of housing that we have, maybe climate, maybe where we are in the world, somehow these measures, which were tried everywhere, were not very successful. In Australia, managed to eliminate the pandemic completely in the first few months, eliminate the transmission of the virus from the community here in the first few months of the pandemic. So that was sheer luck, basically. But we took it as a society to say that we've done something really quite fantastic, and then proceeded to do very little to do things better so that we could avoid doing the same things again. And then the pandemic ended up re-emerging in Australia through the hotel quarantine system. And our leaders proceeded to lock down Australia and to impose closed borders again and again and again and again. And these were, as you know, very crude measures that had some very problematic impacts across society, but we seem to have very little in the toolbox. So that to us, again, resonated quite strongly with the experience that Donald Horne was talking about. So we went with this title, and while it obviously has a kind of catchy, especially for an Australian audience, it sort of resonates with that. So there was a little bit of the kind of marketing side to it as well. But it does actually resonate very much with the experience of the pandemic here. And to that extent, I think it's a nice summary of how Australia of the present links up with longer term dynamics that we talk about in the book.
Okay, no, that's great. So in the book, you talk a lot about the need to relearn how to govern, right? Is this large kind of critique about Australian governance? Can you just walk us through that argument and sort of briefly?
Yeah, sure. So the story we tell about Australia is in fact not unique to Australia. It would be very familiar to Canadians, to Americans, to many people in Western Europe as well. So essentially the story is that in the 1970s, there was quite a significant political and economic crisis and social crisis as well, all across the West. People called it in all sorts of different names. Stagflation is the term that they used to refer to the economic situation where you have stagnation and high inflation at the same time, which was thought impossible at the time. So the main political side of it was that governments came to the conclusion, or political elites came to the conclusion, that essentially they're seen as too responsible to what was happening. And in fact, the kind of structures of government of the day, which were more direct, if you like, the Barbarian hierarchy where, if someone sits at the top, they can direct someone down to do, what they would wish as a government, created all sorts of problems for them because people expected them to do things for them, which was the story of the kind of post-war era of the rise of these welfare states, which were doing all sorts of stuff, a lot of it very good for their populations. So they proceeded to try and create a bit more of an arm's length relationship between them and the governing process. It also had an ideological dimension, which people often talk about, which is called neoliberalism, which is when you convince people that the market is what matters and they shouldn't look to government to do things for them. But it also had a very practical dimension to it, which is a lot more important, which is where you create governing processes that actually put elected government at arm's length from those who actually implement and in some cases even those that develop policy. So what I'm talking about, this sounds very abstract, but we're talking about processes like privatization, where you take, things that government once used to do and you privatize them. We talk about things like outsourcing of policy development in some cases. In Australia, consultants have come to play a very large role in policy making. You talk about things like marketizing service delivery, where the agencies involved may not necessarily be private, but you create markets for things like social services that people, for instance, might get a voucher and then they go and choose their preferred provider. You create agencies like often central banks, but many others that are independent of government, and they get to do policy in a whole range of different areas without being directly responsive to elected government. In Australia, again, there's the federal dimension where instead of the governments kind of coming together as governments, the federal government, which has almost all of the money in Australia, has used that to regulate state governments to do things that it would like them to do, which were along the same lines of what I was just describing. So, for instance, if in the past, let's say you're the state government, you run the hospitals, they just give you money and then you run the hospitals. It became more regulated. So the federal government wanted them to run the hospitals in a particular way. So then they essentially would just say, well, that's how we want you to run the hospitals. We'll just dole out a little bit of money as you move towards the goals that we've set for you. So that's what we call regulatory federalism. And all of these things combined created a situation where actually there very little capacity to govern across all levels of government in Australia. But also it allowed political leaders at various levels to avoid accountability for what they were doing, or at least attempt to avoid accountability. I mean, ultimately, people could see that the process was not working well and became very dissatisfied with government, as is the case all over the world, really. But it gave governments, if you like, plausible deniability. They could say, well, it's not us, it's just a particular contractor. It's not us, it's just, an independent agency that was doing this.
Right.
So consequently, when you get a crisis like the pandemic crisis or any serious crisis, government finds itself actually unable to respond. And in the Australian case, and I think in many other cases, one of the ways that they responded, because the capacity to do more sophisticated things through the health system was not really there in many cases, they opted to go for these very crude measures and then opted to use them time and time again.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's a paradoxical situation because on the one hand, you would say that hotel quarantines, lockdowns, vaccine mandates, the whole kind of repertoire of COVID policies were showing the power of the state to govern, right? But in a very sort of authoritarian manner, right? So what you're talking about,
the coercive capacities were not actually they were not removed in the same way. So most governments around the world still have militaries that operate in a hierarchical top-down structure, still police forces that operate in this way. And to some extent, this is partly why these measures were used more, I think, more frequently, because you have someone you can tell to do something and they'll go and do it. But these forces are quite limited in their capacity to do the kind of thing that we actually needed to get done at the time.
So in the book, do you outline some of the alternative policies that could have been implemented had according to your critique, had the Australian state had, a better ability to govern, let's say?
Okay, so that's a great question. I think there are two sides to this. I mean, the first thing is that even the basic plan that the government had in place before the pandemic would have been preferable to what happened in practice. those plans were junked almost before the pandemic even started.
Mm.
So the original plan was a kind of test trace type plan with some limited quarantining involved. Because it was based on the international health regulations, it would not have involved lockdowns, which are obviously not part of it, but not even closed borders in any significant way. But we know that that's not what happened. So essentially, very quickly became apparent that the capacities to do the plan was not there, that even things like surge capacity in hospital was just not really in place. I mean, they're on paper, but they were never actually implemented in practice, which is quite typical of the kind of regulatory state problem that we talk about in the book. So we say, well, the first thing we need to do is just build some of these capacities to actually be there. You want to have public health agencies that are capable of actually doing some serious work. As we saw in some other countries where lockdown, for instance, was not attempted, like Korea, that had built up some of these capacities before. But we're not calling for, this is not just about building up state capacity and just leaving it there, because I think sometimes if you do that, you end up with fairly authoritarian outcomes, which is not what we're about at all. I mean, we saw some really horrendous stuff happening in China in particular, where I went and visited last year and saw some of the the legacy of that, and some pretty traumatized people that I spoke to about what they experienced there, and that's absolutely not what we're calling for. What we would like to see is actually a reinvigoration of the democratic relationship between citizens and society, so that states, instead of having that arm's length relationship between themselves and society that are built up over several decades, actually re-engage society, and we develop together. If plans are to be implemented, these plans need to be discussed democratically. That kind of stuff never happens when it comes to pandemic plans. They're just created by technocrats and just put in place, and sometimes their consequences, as we know, are quite significant. So we want to reinvigorate that side of things as well. And in Australia, there's been some various movements in relation to improving state capacity. Since we had the pandemic, there's a talk of creating an Australian Centres for Disease Control, ACDC, which is quite apt in the Australian context. And, some of that stuff is really important and needs to be done. But we don't necessarily want a situation where, say an ACDC could impose lockdown again. We want to create a situation where we would have a say over the kind of plans that governments develop and how these plans are implemented.
So there's sort of two linked questions or comments in response to what you're saying. One is, it would seem that after the pandemic, we're actually living in a more fractured society, where the public is more distrustful of the state because of the policies that were, and especially public health, because of the policies that were implemented. I mean, in the US, as in Australia, we had a lot of vaccine mandates, and that was very polarizing after the lockdowns, after the school closures, and the whole sort of other retinue of policies. And so I would guess that Australian society is similar to other places in the West, where that fracturing has, and that distrust has actually grown. And then in relationship to that, what I see in many different countries is a lack of accountability in the public health establishment itself about those mistakes. And in fact, even this corrosive discourse about misinformation or so-called anti-science. So anything that, questions the authorities is pegged as this sort of malicious nonsense. So I'm kind of curious in Australia if there's an effort in the public health community to admit mistakes, and what that process of building a democratic, democratic cohesion would look like, or, if that's more of a pipe dream, or what do you think?
Well, firstly, I would say that in Australia, there's not really been any that kind of reckoning that you talk about among public health people. In fact, the trend has almost, if anything, gone in the other direction, where they celebrate the fact that Australia managed to keep its, at least in the early parts of the pandemic, its number of infections and mortalities with COVID-19 to relatively low levels. Of course, later on, those circumstances change a little bit. But as I mentioned before, a lot of that can be attributed to luck, and it's not something that we wish to replicate. And even so, Melbourne spent over 260 days in lockdown during the pandemic. I mean, we didn't have the same situation here in Brisbane, but we had closed borders for pretty much the entire pandemic. And just to give our viewers, listeners, a bit of a sense of what it was like, I live in Brisbane, which is the capital city of Queensland. We are about an hour drive from the border to New South Wales, which is another state. And that border, it's basically a town called Coolangatta, which is part of Australia's Gold Coast. And on the other side of the border, there's another town called Tweed Heads. This is the same town. I'm sure that many countries around the world have that, where you have states where have basically the same town on either side of the state border.
Right.
That border was made into a hard border, and there are police and mounted police and military patrolling that border inside the same town. I mean, so that's the extent to which things played out at the time during the pandemic. So it was pretty extreme. So although we didn't have the lockdowns, we had that side of it as well. But interestingly, so there's not been any of that reckoning. In fact, like I said, people are kind of celebrating Australia's record, which I think is a problem. But I think politically also Australia is not quite as fractured as many as some of these other countries you mentioned. And there are various reasons for that. But I think one of them is the fact that the pandemic did not have quite the same impact here as it did in other countries because of the circumstances that I'm discussing. There are pockets of resistance to these policies, especially within Melbourne, because of what it went through. But it was not anywhere near as widespread and as big as it was in other countries. And in fact, in Australia, governments were seen to have been punished by voters, not for, doing those kinds of things, but actually in some cases for not doing those kinds of things. So when the federal government lost the election in 2022, many people perceived that to have been partly because of the fact that it was seen to be not quite as serious about dealing with the pandemic as other countries. So that's a very interesting conversation in its own right, why that happened here. And it's quite a big one too.
Right.
But I think that it does, I think, provide opportunities for doing things maybe more cohesively here. Notwithstanding, those problems, especially around vaccine mandates, which were very real. But I think that, given that it took a long time to get us there, getting us out of here is going to take a long time as well. And it's a wider process than public health. I mean, this aspect of it is only just one of many aspects of public policy where the state created this arm's length relationship between itself and citizens. And I don't get the sense that certainly at the political level, there is any kind of real thirst for moving in the opposite direction, because it does require putting yourself out there. I mean, you are going to be taking more hits, presumably, if you seem to be more directly responsible for public policy. Also, the kinds of societies that we had at the time when these institutions were created, which were, as you say, less fragmented. I'm talking about, back in the kind of post-war decades, where society was a bit more organized into larger movements like the labor movement and so on. That society does not exist. So that project is a very tough project, but arguably that's what we need to do in order to get very different outcomes, in my view. And it's not just about the pandemic. It's about a whole range of crises that come up time and again, where we find that our states are simultaneously unable to do what needs to be done and authoritarian in their response.
Right. But yeah,
so
what you're telling us also is that the Australian public expects and wants more of that sort of paternalistic authoritarian governance, right? Is that?
Yeah, that's I mean, Australia sometimes is seen as like a mini US, but it's actually a very different country, and with very different history. And in Australia, the state has always played quite a big part in people's lives. It's historically also had fairly paternalistic relationship with people. I mean, not to say that it's always been enacted in this particular way, which is I think quite extreme, what we saw during the pandemic. But I think people have, rather different expectations of the state. Having said that, if in the first few months of the pandemic, those measures were taken and did not yield that particular outcome that we got here, which is zero COVID, it created, we talk about that a lot in the book. It completely changed the game, and not necessarily in a good way. So it was celebrated as being a great achievement, and undoubtedly some lives were saved by the fact that zero COVID ran coast to coast in Australia for a while, and for many states it was even more than that. But it set an unrealistic benchmark for what a
Right.
COVID response needs to look like. And
Mm.
that is part of the story of how we ended up going down this path of just having
Okay.
more lockdowns, more closed
Right.
borders. But people expected it because, or wanted it because they thought the zero COVID is it. They thought that's what we need to
Right.
have. But of
Okay.
course, it's impossible to maintain zero COVID when you have a pandemic of any kind.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can't,
Right.
sever your connections to the world indefinitely and all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So eventually, when the pandemic returned to Australia in different ways, people just struggled to accept that
Right.
and continued to demand zero COVID, or at least many people did.
Mm-mm.
And that is a unique part of the Australian experience, but also the New Zealand experience, which is very
Right.
similar in many ways. And
Right.
Tom and I, we don't write about that a lot in the book, but he actually wrote some opinion pieces about the New Zealand experience that show that it's actually quite a similar experience to the Australian one.
Okay.
And it's
So
because of that zero COVID dimension.
right. So the collective memory is one that, had we continued to pursue that path, we would have
Yeah.
avoided, and we should have maintained that. And it's a failure of governance. And I would imagine there's a lack of appreciation of the role of herd immunity and seasonality and sort of the role of chance, as you mentioned, in terms of how these viruses are, spread and the epidemiological realities underpinning them.
Yeah,
And the sort of
absolutely.
illusion of control that was given was so stark, let's say, in the Australian case.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about the situation here, it's just sheer luck that when the lockdowns and the original lockdowns and the closed borders were imposed in March 2020, it's just sheer luck. 20% of infections in Australia at the time came from community transmission in Australia. The rest
Mm,
of them were still imported from overseas at that point, only
yeah.
20%. I mean, that's just luck. We didn't even do it first. We didn't. We actually followed many other countries. By the time that we imposed these
Right.
measures, we're far from the first to do that. Other
Yeah.
countries did the same thing, but they couldn't achieve what we've achieved simply
Mm,
because of our geography. And
mm,
also, I don't know if you've been here, but Australia is a very suburban country where
mm.
most people live in homes with gardens and so on. And we know
Right.
the ventilation is a very important aspect of how this particular virus, or any virus almost,
Mm,
any of those kinds of from respiratory kind of viruses.
mm.
Generally, fresh air helps reduce transmission, and we have
Yeah.
plenty of it. So
Right.
these are just that's just sheer luck.
Yeah.
Could have happened very differently, but that's not how the story was told at the time.
Right.
It was
Right.
told at the time as a story of government doing decisive things, getting things
Right.
done,
Yeah.
and people bought it. They bought
Mm,
it.
mm, mm. And so now over time, I mean, there's a lot of research in Australia about the mental health harms of lockdown, especially in Melbourne and other places. Is the public coming to appreciate? And I don't know what the debt, how much government spending was done in sort of the increase of government debt, and in a lot of countries, there's a cut in social services and even healthcare spending, right, post pandemic because of just the astronomical amount of money government spent. So is there sort of a sense that the policies that we implemented just caused more harm than good, or what's the national conversation or pulse around that debate?
My sense is that most people in Australia would like to put the pandemic behind them. I
Mm,
think that's the case in many countries. I think that the general discourse, if I'm attuned to what's happening, is that, look, I mean, mistakes were made, but overall, we did okay compared to all these other countries.
mm,
So now is the time to kind of move on. And
mm.
government is very much a part of that discourse. Government has no particular interest at any level in kind of digging too deeply into what happened at the time.
Okay.
There is an inquiry, but it's fairly limited in what it's set itself to do.
Mm,
Quite remarkably, the inquiry, it's a federal inquiry, but it will not investigate what states were doing. But of course, these control measures were all imposed by states in Australia because that is just the nature of governance in this country. So
yeah.
if you're going to, I mean, a lot of that was partly coordinated. They had this group, the National Cabinet, where they used to meet, presumably
Yeah.
via Zoom, to discuss these
Right.
control measures.
Yeah.
But most of the decisions were taken at the state level. It's the states that lock down
Yeah.
ultimately.
Yeah.
But currently, I'm not aware of any serious inquiries into that level,
Okay.
or more comprehensive inquiry. And Yeah, I think that generally the sense is that Australia weathered this reasonably well compared to other countries.
Okay.
The public mood is one of let's just move on.
Okay.
I
I
think
think
I
there
think
was
the debt issue. Sorry.
there was some comments recently in the Guardian and other newspapers. I think there was a commission, and they were calling for or there was some sort of evaluation. Then they were calling for a royal commission. So I guess there might be a further sort of benchmark to that evaluation, but it doesn't sound like you're so optimistic about where that goes.
No, the government, actually, the current government, which is a Labor government, promised a royal commission when they were in opposition and wanting to get elected. But when they came into power, they actually decided not to do that, and they chose a
Okay.
more limited commission of inquiry. Um, I mean, I think that um, if the reason why they wanted at the time to have a royal commission was not in fact to criticize the measures that the previous government
Mm.
supported, the federal government. Like I said, the federal government is not really the one that does a lot of the kind of NPI stuff that we
Yeah.
saw. It's the
Right.
state governments.
Yeah.
So I think if anything, they wanted to push the government on its record as being seen as being a little bit too lax
Okay.
on the pandemic compared to the
Okay.
states, because
Right.
most of the state governments were Labor governments.
Right.
Not that there was a big difference between the one that were not Labor governments, to be quite frank, but
Mm.
most of them were Labor governments, and they were seen
Mm.
to be, at least in the eyes of many, as the kind of the good guys in this story, where the federal
Right.
government was a little bit kind of. I think that's not entirely right, to be quite frank. I think the federal government was broadly on board with everything they did.
Yeah.
Um, it also implemented some very significant measures. I mean, the debt stuff that you talked about, that's federal government in Australia.
Mm.
They uh, created a huge amount of money in a short time,
Mm.
and then used it to fund the pandemic response, to fund the lockdowns and so on. So they're definitely
Mm.
a part of that story. But I think
Mm.
the current government, when they were in opposition, they were trying to kind of hedge them on the side of you haven't done enough, which
Mm.
is again a kind of
Yeah.
indication of the kind of public discourse that we have.
Right. Right.
And that's one of my frustrations, because I mean, from the very beginning, in not the very beginning, but um, Tom and I, one of the motivations we had for writing the book is actually that he was in Melbourne, and he was going through some pretty terrible time there, like many other people, just
Mm.
being in lockdown for many, many months, while the rest of the country, this is sort of winter, the southern winter of
Yeah.
2020.
And I think at that time, Melbourne had the distinction of being the city of the place in the world that had been locked down for the longest. I think, if
Well, that
I'm
was
correct.
actually its record at the end of the pandemic,
Okay.
basically. Yeah, but at that time, so in the winter, the southern winter, which is kind of June, July, August, September, etc., of 2020, the rest of the country was doing okay at that point because we had that zero COVID. But
Right.
in Melbourne, because of failings in hotel quarantine, the pandemic was reintroduced, and then Melbourne ended up spending about 100 and so days in lockdown, as the rest of the country was not in lockdown.
Okay.
So at the
Right.
time, so Tom and I are good friends. We talk every day pretty much, and
Mm.
we sort of trying to figure out what was going on, as
Mm.
many people were at the time. And one of the things that as political scientists, we sort of look at things maybe a little bit differently to how some people do. And we basically came to the conclusion that the stuff that happened in Melbourne, the stuff that led to those lockdowns, could have happened anywhere around Australia, but that's not how the story was told at the time. It was basically said, look, all of us are doing great here in Australia. We know exactly how to deal with this pandemic.
Mm.
In Victoria, they stuffed it up. They just
Right.
there's something unique about how they dealt with the pandemic, which was very bad. A
Right.
lot of the talk was about bringing private security to manage the hotel quarantine,
Yeah.
which is definitely a part of the story. But there was something unique about how Victoria did it.
Yeah.
And the government of the day, which was from a different political party to the
Yeah.
government in Victoria, was quite happy to, have a go at Victorian government
Right.
repeatedly, and say how bad they were at managing the pandemic and so on. But we're
Mm.
looking at like the same stuff basically that happened there could have happened anywhere around this country.
Mm.
It's the same kind of response, broadly speaking. And then later on in 2021, I wrote a piece, an op-ed piece called "Arguing with Success."
Mm.
And at that point, Australia was perceived to be a success story. But we felt that that success was built on luck largely,
Yeah.
and it had all those elements that we were discussing previously. So the title was Arguing with Success, and I try to publish that piece in Australia, and I've published many opinion pieces. If people want to go and chase it up, I've got a long experience of writing opinion pieces for the media in Australia and some
Yeah.
very significant publications. I could not get this piece published anywhere,
Right.
anywhere,
Yeah.
because everyone was saying at the time that there's no point even talking about that because we know what we're doing. We're actually doing really well. And
Mm.
I remember getting a response from somebody from one of the media organizations saying, well, maybe there will be a point at some point, writing a kind of, more of a thinking back about the pandemic
Right.
kind of piece. And
Yeah.
I'm like, no, no, we're
Postmortem.
still there. You know what I mean?
Right.
These are issues that are still very, very much alive. So they didn't want to
Yeah.
publish it. I ended up getting it published in the very famous Australian publication, the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong.
Mm.
People
Yeah.
can go and have a look at it. This is May 2021, basically
Yeah.
arguing about all these issues that we talked about already.
Mm.
2 months later, half the country was in lockdown and remained in lockdown. Basically, this is from July 2021 until we reach a certain threshold of vaccination where the government's basically reopened again.
Right.
So there was just unwillingness really to look
Mm.
closely at what was happening
Seriously.
here all the
Right.
way through.
Right.
And then as soon as we, sort of reached that vaccination milestone and started reopening,
Right.
and reopened to the world at some point as well,
Yeah.
people were very keen to quickly move on.
Right. Right.
And to me, that's a great frustration because I don't feel like many of the issues that led
Mm.
us to that point, to that place, actually been resolved. And even
Mm.
if you want to think about it in terms of just even the lockdown, even if we're going to do that again, which I'd be quite horrified if we did.
Mm.
Even if we did that again, I don't think we'll get the same outcome necessarily. I mean, this was
Right.
again just pure luck of the
Yeah.
time that we're just lucky to have done it
Yeah.
at the time when it had that impact.
Yeah.
A different kind of virus may not even react in this way as well. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
so to me, that's a great frustration, but I don't feel like there's a great willingness either from government or from the wider public to really look into it.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I think your discussion about luck and chance is actually something that's really undervalued and not discussed enough, right? In this whole experience of COVID. So it's refreshing actually to hear the word chance and luck thrown in here. So yeah, thanks so much for the conversation. And that was Professor Shahar Hameiri, the author, along with Tom Chodor, of The Locked Up Country, Learning the Lessons from Australia's COVID-19 Response. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Kevin.